Okay, so what can we do to enhance the organization in such a way that we can kind of break away from these constraints that are keeping people from actually doing their best? Here are a few different things that we can do. So, in addition to relaxing organizational constraints, like enhancing internal aspects of the job that people find motivating, we can also utilize incentives and reward systems. And these are actually good at boosting productivity. They enhance the quantity of work that's being produced, if not the quality itself. So I would say if you're going to utilize these kind of systems, really try as best you can to really emphasize that quality of work matters. Generally, this is much easy. These kind of systems tend to work a little bit easier for simple behaviors that boost productivity. So even though you can use this for performance, it's often better for simpler tasks like making deadlines, reducing tardies, utilizing attendance, and so on. So for example, let's say that we're looking at something like a piece rate system. So you basically get paid for how many units of production you work. This is either going to be something like a commission system. So in retail, sometimes you earn a commission for selling a particular product. My mom used to work at the like maybe about 10 years ago, she worked at the shoe department in a Dillard's, and she would make commission for selling a particular type of shoe or a particular brand of shoe during the week. And the more of those units that she sold, the more of a commission that she made. If you're working in a factory, for example, you might be getting paid on the basis of piecework. For a time, my father was working at a factory, basically helping build shocks for cars. And so he would get paid on the basis of how many of those were being produced. So if you want to make these kind of incentive systems work, especially with something like a piece rate system, here's kind of what you need. So first of all, the incentive has to be predicated on a few different things. Can you do a better job than you're actually doing? If you're out there giving it your absolute best every day, the incentive is not necessarily going to make you work harder. So the worker kind of has to recognize that there is a need for improvement there. If they don't think they can do much better than they're doing, the incentive's not going to work. Additionally, the incentive has to be something that they actually want. So, for example, we do a lot of different giveaways for assessment day. This year, we're doing $15 gift cards for people who complete their online assessments since we can't have them in person. Now, if you don't care about a $15 gift card, that is not going to motivate you to complete those surveys in any sort of way. As the chair of assessment, I hope you do, but I also understand that it might not be motivating enough for you. Additionally, there need to be few constraints in the organization at that point. Again, if you have organizational constraints that are preventing people from doing their job, so for example, if you work for a publisher and the printing presses are always breaking down, that is an organizational constraint. You can't do your job. If you're not getting good feedback, if you don't really have a strong sense of autonomy, these incentives will not work because the problem is not with the worker. The problem is with the organization. So you want to try as much as you can to make sure that organizational constraints are not in place. So incentives are only going to work if you feel like there's a need for improvement, you actually want the incentive, and there are already few organizational constraints. And this is simultaneously helpful because it helps us understand that this is what you're going to need to be able to boost productivity and boost job performance with an incentive. But it also helps explain why incentives sometimes fall short. And it's for these reasons. If you're lacking any of these aspects, the incentive's not going to work. And that's something to keep in mind. So now I want to talk about another aspect of productivity. We're going to talk about human factors and how this kind of relates to how people do their work or how people do their jobs. So, human factors is a field of psychology that looks at the interface between the people and the physical environment. So, how are people using tools? How are people using equipment? How are people using displays? And how are they using controls? And so, this is actually a pretty interesting field. It is technically a psychological field, but it incorporates aspects related to design, it relates to engineering, and also cognition. So, it's very much an interdisciplinary field. When I was a postdoc at Georgia Tech, the Human Factors Division of the School of Psychology was actually called Engineering Psychology. It's all about designing products and displays and interfaces that make them easier for users to understand and operate. So let's talk about good displays. So generally, displays are one of the ways that people can be provided with information. So information that people need can be provided and delivered to them in different sorts of ways. Now, how it is presented depends on the type of information that it is and what it's being used for. So one of the interesting things, I think this really fits with what's kind of going on right now. There are certain types of classes that really lend themselves, like, not great to online teaching because, well, none of us signed up for this. We're basically operating in crisis mode. But there are certain types of fields that have a much more difficult time making the jump from in-person to online. And it's been kind of interesting to see, especially the way that the fine arts department and the music department has really tried to make this work. Like, with me, I lecture. It's not that hard to screencast a lecture, write one up in advance and deliver it to you. Now, I don't get real-time questions. I don't get real-time feedback. So that's where I kind of require y'all to jump in with email, with communicating with me if you do have any questions. But I've also heard that for laboratory classes, which are typically hands-on, this is going to be a little bit more difficult to do. And with certain very technical concepts, I would say, for example, something like a chemistry class, that at least the first time that you're presented with something, you may not get it right away. With something like a mathematics class or more advanced science classes, online interfaces might be a little bit more difficult. Generally, displays make use of both auditory or visual information. Sometimes they make use of both. So, for example, what you're looking at here is the kind of display that you would see for flying an airplane. And this is not terrible to read, but you can kind of see that it's not a bad display. So how it tends to work is it kind of operates like a clock. It's letting you know your current altitude. And this is done in thousands of feet. Now, these bigger arrows and these smaller arrows do make it a little bit more difficult to deal with. But the idea being here that the higher up you go, the larger this number gets. Now, when you start going above 10,000 feet, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult. So this display does have some aspects that are a little harder to understand. So typically, this is an okay display, but this digital display is better. It automatically tells you numerically what your feet are, and it also tells you about your current longitude. So displays can be good or displays can be bad, as we see. But when we talk about ergonomics and human factors, we're not just talking about displays. We're also talking about controls. And control designs ultimately depend on their purpose and the situation that you need them for. So, for example, is the control Very, very complicated. Is the control absolutely critical for utilizing the particular apparatus or instrument that you are trying to use? Is this something that needs a very precise control? Is this something that needs a little bit more power to be able to operate? So control designs ultimately depend on the purpose and on the situation. So here's an example. A lot of the controls that we utilize are performed by the hands, or they're performed by the feet. Now, I'd like you to think a little bit about the different types of movements that your hands can do versus the different types of movements that your feet do. So in general, hands are pretty precise operators. Hands and fingers can do very, very precise movements. And so for an instrument that's very complicated, you want to make sure that you are using your hands. So for example, when you're dealing with a gear shift in a car, you generally don't necessarily want to be able to operate a gear shift too easily. Because you could suddenly shift into reverse while you're driving on the road and drive just because of a very simple movement. So what you'll usually see with a lot of automatic gear shifts is that you have to press down a button and then you have to move the object. So it's a little bit more precise. So you want to use hands for precise controls or for things that are absolutely critical, like steering your car. Now, on the other hand, feet are not very sophisticated movers. Have you ever tried to pick up anything with your feet or do anything special with your toes? It's not very good. So generally for feet, we want to use our feet for simple movements that require a lot of power or a lot of sustained, like staying in place. So feet are very, very good for things like the brake. It's a very simple, powerful movement. If you have to slam on the brakes, you're not going to have a good time, but your feet are powerful enough and they can work quickly enough that that the car will stop. Now, would you necessarily want to use a hand brake for a car? Probably not. If you have to do a complicated movement to get your car to stop, you will have already wrecked the car. So feet are really good for powerful movements that we have to do very, very quickly and without much thought. So feet are really good for simple movements that we have to enact quickly, like a gas or a brake pedal. Hands are very good for sophisticated movements that we have to use very, very carefully. Likewise, we can see this with good designs and bad designs. So here we have an ergonomic paintbrush. One of the things that's really difficult about working with a paintbrush is that with standard paintbrushes, you're constantly doing this motion. And as somebody who has painted part of a house many, many years ago, it is murder on your wrist. You can get carpal tunnel by doing things like this. But you don't necessarily always want a roller either. Sometimes you need to make a more precise movement, but this wrist action can be quite painful if you constantly have to repeat it. An ergonomic paintbrush like this allows you to do a paint maneuver. And it's a very, very small brush, so you can do more detailed work with it instead of working with a roller. And additionally, you're not constantly doing this with your wrist and creating a situation where you might temporarily have some wrist issues. So this is what we would call an ergonomically designed paintbrush. It's a very good design. Now, on the other hand, take a look at this teapot. This is a case of very, very bad design. Why? Because when you pick up the handle of the teapot, the spout is on the same time or on the same side. You're going to get some hot water on your hand and you're probably going to burn yourself. This is a terrible teapot. I'd like to have it in my house because I think it looks neat, but I would never ever use it. So what are the general rules for designing different controls? Here's what you need to consider. First of all, it should be in a really logical place. Imagine if you wanted to use the gas or the brake in your car and you had to lift up your foot and like press it by the door. That is not a very logical place for the brake to be. If the brake is going to be by your foot, the controls should be right by your feet. Likewise, a handle that you need to use should ideally be around the level that your hands are. You don't want to have to do any complicated reaching up movements or down movements. So for example, here's an example of a really bad control that I notice sometimes. When you're in Rainy and you go and get hot water from the coffee dispenser, there are actually two places that you can get it. You can get it at the bottom, where you're able to actually see the hot water filling in the cup if you want tea. And there's one high up. That high up one is a really bad design because you can't see the water actually filling up in the cup unless you're tall. And because of that, you're running the risk of potentially having hot water overflow in that cup and you won't be able to see it and you might burn yourself. So in that case, it's not in a very logical place. The controls for the same function should be located together. So for example, shifting gears and an emergency brake in a car are typically in the same place, or they're in a very similar place. They're located near your hands. I have seen instances where the gear shift is located on a bar that extends out from the steering wheel, sort of like the blinker does. So generally, controls that are being used for the same function should be kind of located together. Your gas gauge and your oil filter temperature should probably be located together because they're letting you know about the health of your vehicle. Controls with important consequences should be recognized by touch. They should not be hard to find. The emergency brake is located right next to the gear shift, has a very logical handle. It's in a place where you can very quickly grab it if you need it. You should have appropriate feedback. So if you engage the system, it should click or show you a display that it's on. So when you turn on your lights or when you turn on your brights, you will get a visual display that your lights are on or your brights are on. If you use your blinker, you will hear it clicking. So we should have appropriate feedback so we know that we're actually using the thing that we're supposed to. And additionally, directions should match the direction in which the machine moves. So generally, if I turn my steering wheel to the right, the car should go right. If I turn my steering wheel to the left, it should go left. Up should go up, down should go down. If we're going in opposite directions, like some video games do, where down is up and up is down, that's going to be harder for us to actually use. Likewise, for your windows, when you press the button down, the window should go down. When you press the button up, the window should go up. Now, here are some cases of really bad ergonomic design for fun. So here is a case where the coffee holder is, the drink holder is right in front of the car's CD unit. Here is a case where our CD player is all the way up here. The buttons for the tape player are with the CD player. So again, here is a case where items with a similar function are not being grouped together. The tape buttons are located near the CD player. The CD buttons are located near the tape player. That's pretty bad. Here's that hot water example that I mentioned. The button for the hot water and the tap for the hot water is, we have high. So the button for the hot water is high and the tap for the hot water is below. This is going to be really confusing. Here is a case where this button makes the volume go up, but it doesn't look like it's going up. This one makes the volume go down. This is really confusing, and it would work a lot better if this button were going this way to match the triangle that it's on top of. And here, it's kind of hard. You don't want to place your drinks in front of other controls. So the coffee holder is in the way of the CD unit. That is a very, very bad design. So, another area of human factors that is starting to become incredibly important are computer and human interactions. And this has taken a large focus in human factors research. There are a lot of issues related to communication between employees and computers. And this is a case where trying to think of how a computer would work through a solution versus how a human would work through a solution. So, having a really good mental model is key. The computer should be designed to kind of work the way that a human does, but work a little bit better or a little bit faster. So, what sort of things will improve this interface? First of all, training is critical. You're going to have a very hard time dealing with computers and new technology if you don't have computer skills. This also means that for hardware and for software updates that change very rapidly, you want to keep up to date with those, you want to get familiar with those, and you need to actually use those. What aspects of training can be found to really enhance efficiency with computers? We actually find that animated models that actually show the computer system and how it works and kind of a walkthrough of how it works seems to work the best. And this comes from back in 1991 when computers were actually pretty terrible. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We'll talk some more about human factors, and we'll start talking about organizational citizenship soon.